The diversity, equity, and inclusion movement in the U.S. has its roots in the 1960s civil rights movement, while psychological safety was conceptualized at the dawn of the 21st century. The connection between the two has only been made recently. We'll talk with a DE&I professional who has made the connection on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA. Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. This podcast focuses on psychological health and safety from the perspective of an occupational health and safety professional. However, there's no question that discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion are certainly becoming more common, and focusing that discussion around the concept of psychological safety. I think it's important to kind of mention that because those terms sometimes they're related, they're very, very similar, but they're slightly different. And so a safety guide talks about the psychological health and safety piece, but recognizes the importance of the concept of psychological safety. And if you want to get diversity, equity, and inclusion, it has to be safe for everyone. So in this episode, we have the honor of having someone with expertise in both DE&I and psychological safety. So our guest is Sacha Thompson. She's the founder of the Equity Equation, LLC. It's a boutique inclusive culture consulting and coaching firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. She has 20 years of experience in education, nonprofit, tech industries, and her work is about removing barriers or providing support in order to get to a place of equity. She helps executives and leaders have important dialogue and coaches them to get to that place, that necessary place of long-term change, so you can actually have the culture of inclusion that you talk about. So let's get the conversation started. And I start my podcast with I don't think it's a unique question, but some people think it is. My first question, Sacha, is who is Sacha Thompson?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. Who is Sacha Thompson? I am the inclusive culture curator. I am a diversity coach. I am an ICF certified coach, ACC. I am a bonus mom of two 15-year-old boys with a wonderful partner. I am a daughter. I am a sister. I am a dancer. I think I'm a comedian sometimes. I make myself laugh. I am all of those things to so many people. And so I am honored to be here today.
Sure. So a dancer as well.
Yes.
So what type of dance? I'm curious.
I actually did ballet for 22 years.
Really?
And then kind of morphed into being an older adult doing other types of dance. So I've done some belly dancing. I've done all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I love to stay active when I can.
Sure enough. Wow. So you never know.
You never know.
You just never know. Wow, ballet. Ballet is athletics, boy, because that's not easy stuff.
Not at
least
all.
From what I've heard.
Not at all. And it's funny being at this age now and trying to do things I did 20 years ago. Yeah. The body quickly tells you that you are not where you used to be.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so and again, I it's always interesting to me to get people on this podcast talking about psychological health and safety who actually have some concept about what psychological safety is.
Mhm.
And in terms of a practitioner, I really enjoyed your series recently, the the 12 days of psychological safety. I didn't catch all of them. I caught about half during the holidays, but I think it's really important that we have conversations here in the United States about what it is. And so when you hear the term or the set of words psychological health and safety, what does that engender for you? What does that mean to you?
It's interesting because I didn't really think about it in that concept until you and I started talking, right? And so it was really that connection between um, how you are treated at work and the environment that you're in and the impact that that has on you, right? Physically. And so the aha moments that I started having after our conversations really were, wow, I was in situations where um, I was getting ulcers, I was getting headaches, hair was falling out because of the environment that I was in, right? It was impacting my health, like literally impacting my health. And so it took me going through that personally to make that connection between the psychological safety and what I was looking for in a workplace and the impact that not having that was having on my physical being. And so that's kind of the connection that I made when we started having these conversations.
Sure. So let's dig into that a bit because
Mhm.
I think it's really important to the extent you can share. You said you've had a lived experience of physical kinds of reactions to the stress. So unless you want to, you have to name where it was. But
Right.
what was that like? I mean, so how did you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So I was working in corporate
Sure.
and I was in a situation where I was in a role, a diversity role that people didn't understand. This was before George Floyd. This is
Mm,
before it was kind of the hot topic. And I was leading a team, a global team, and folks just didn't understand why this team in marketing was doing diversity and inclusion work, right? It wasn't marketing and it should have been in HR. And I'm like, no, this isn't HR. I'm doing outreach to underrepresented communities around this particular topic. And so what ended up happening, because people didn't understand, there was one particular leader or a couple of leaders that did whatever she could in her power to disrupt my team, disrupt the
wow.
work,
Wow.
started positioning me as a bully, started talking to folks on my team to get them to join her team. You don't want to be around a bully or someone that is negative. Put out stories that I was I was a disgruntled employee.
Wow.
Started leaving me off of meetings, those types of things. And it created this environment where I started questioning myself, like, okay,
Mm,
I know I'm not doing this wrong. I've been doing this work for quite a while. But I'm noticing that there are meetings happening that I should be a part of that I'm
mm,
not a part of.
mm.
Or I'm sending messages and they're being ignored. Right. And so when I went to my HR business partner and basically said, hey, this is what I think is happening, was told, get over it.
Mm, mm.
Right. So I was just in this environment that they were trying to push me out, trying to kick me out. I went from doing this phenomenal event to now being put on a performance plan. And I'm like, okay, well, how did that even happen? No one can tell me why I was being put on the performance plan. I had to put someone on a performance plan before, so I knew the process and the procedures. And so I'm like, okay, so which goal am I not meeting? Which area do I need help in? No one can give me answers.
Sure.
So again, it's like this helpless feeling of I see what's happening and I have no control over that. Add to that, this was the start right before the pandemic.
Oh,
So there's that added stress of I can't just leave this job because companies are getting rid of diversity and inclusion folks
mm,
right now. So what do I do? So I have to kind of stay in this miserable state
mm,
until I kind of figure things out. But in that process, again, I was rushed to the ER 3 times. Hair started falling out kind of in clumps, insomnia, all of these other things, because there was this constant stress that I was under. And so I got to a point where luck habit and how things operate in the world, right after the murder of George Floyd, there was this push for this leader. Okay, you're heading this. What are you going to do about, what's happening with our Black employees? And she had no idea. And so all of a sudden, this person that was dismissed as a disgruntled employee was now being tapped to say, well, help us put together X, Y, and Z, help us do this. And by that point, I was just like, you know what? I see how you all treated me.
Right.
When you thought that I was disposable, I'm good.
Right.
Right. So I ended up leaving. Luckily, I ended up on a team, or having a team leader that was another Black woman that saw what was kind of happening, and protected me until I could figure out what I wanted to do. And so I was able to leave in a way that was much more healthy for me. But that process it was only 6 months, but the impact that had on me physically and mentally was something that I don't think anyone should ever have to go through. And so what's interesting about this is, toward the end of my time there, she said, I will invest in whatever type of trainings, that you need and support. And the first one that I did was the 4 stages of psychological safety.
Wow. Sure.
Because I knew that that's not what I had. Right.
That's right. Yeah. Well, first of all, let me thank you for trusting me enough to share that. I do have to say it sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And sadly, there's almost a stereotype that I've developed in my head about people who go through it, because for so many people, it affects them long term, and it shows on their countenance. Yeah. The way they interact with folks, or they don't, that they were so traumatized by that they still continue to do it. And they take that trauma to other people, and it kind of comes out. And but you don't look like a person you don't come across as a person that has been through that. It took me
a while to work through that, right? Yeah. I realized that I had gone through a traumatic experience.
Yes.
And I think what was important to me, and I coach people on this all the time, is don't go from one traumatic experience into another.
Yes.
Right. You have to give yourself time to heal and understand what that healing looks like, and understand what you need, the barriers and boundaries that you need to set for yourself, so that you're not in those situations again, right? Be able to recognize some of those red flags, those hazards.
Sure.
So that you can protect yourself. Because I think so many people are looking at, okay, well, I just need a job. No, you don't need just a job. You need one that is going to value you and what you bring to the table. And so it causes us to really do some more due diligence before we get into these environments, because again, we don't want to continuously put ourselves through that trauma.
Absolutely. Wow. Wow. So you chatted a bit about your background in diversity, equity, and inclusion as a thing, as a profession. So how'd that come apart? How did you start to focus on diversity and equity and inclusion as a focus of your work?
Everyone asked me this question, and it's so funny because I'm like, I was born into it. But but I think honestly, being someone whose family immigrated to the United States, I came here when I was 2. So I always saw myself as an other, and always kind of operated between these two worlds. And then when I got to college, I was exposed to more Caribbean students and found sociology, and was just absolutely fascinated with sociology, and focused all of my studies really on cultural diversity and ethnicity. And at the same time, I worked in the Office of Multicultural Affairs as my work study. So that is kind of where I got the foundation and grounding for this work. And every job that I've had since then has touched on diversity and inclusion in some way. There's probably a little break of time where I didn't, but everything has been around creating programs or opportunities for those that are underrepresented. Um, Looking at equity in different ways, or building strategic partnerships and alliances in areas that are usually underrepresented in certain areas. So I did that for several years. I worked for the company that owns the GMAT test and did that for them in strategic alliances and partnerships and field marketing and focusing on HBCUs and women's colleges and tribal colleges. And so every single job that I've had, the only time that I didn't touch diversity and inclusion was probably for 3 or 4 years when I took a marketing job in tech, when I first started in tech. And then I went to another company where I was the first Black female that they hired. And that DEI hat came back on pretty quickly,
Imagine that.
Right. I was just like, oh, there's some things that y'all need to understand, or we're about to change the name of this company to Sacha. So,
right.
So yeah, it's just been something that I've always done. And it was oddly enough, that company, I helped them launch their first diversity initiatives. And one of the vice presidents said to me, well, Sash, you are doing like 3 jobs right now. What do you want to do? And I was like, I would love to do a diversity and inclusion role that touched strategic alliances, that touched marketing, that kind of did all of those things. My chief marketing officer kind of laughed and was just like, you'll never find a job like that. And probably within 2 months, I ended up finding a job leading inclusion marketing for another tech company.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just always been something that I've done. I've been passionate about. I'm always curious about learning about different people and cultures. But as I've been doing more and more of this work, I've been learning about the LGBTQ plus community and all aspects of disability, and just it's just opened my eyes. But it's always been something too that it's just the curiosity in me.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you shared a little bit earlier, at least one of the experiences that led you to focusing on psychological safety. And I again, for disclosure, there are those out there who believe that there's some sort of conflict between these terms that I talked about. So in my research, my definition in my research around psychosocial hazards is unique because I found about 10 or 12 around the world. But my definition is a psychosocial hazard is a psychosocial factor that is perceived or experienced by the person exposed as a threat and in turn affects their behavior. Psycho, how you think; social, how you act. So that's that whole lane of psychosocial hazard identification and mitigation as a safety professional is really important to me. Yeah. And that's how I approach it. Because of what I'm finding is that a lot of these organizations who have diversity, equity, and inclusion problems have them because they have psychological safety absence. Yeah. And the absence is based on the fact of overexposure to a hazard that they don't pay any attention to. And I also find that they aren't paying attention to the other 5 hazards either, because there are chemical hazards and biological, there's a bunch of other stuff going on.
Yeah.
So that's how I started to make the connection. But you're also one of the first folks that I've met who's actually certified in the 4 stages. Because people, again, there are those who will say that that's kind of foo-foo. I honestly, I don't think so. I think that it's important to recognize that you can have a level of psychological safety, but not really. So talk a little bit about the 4 stages and your understanding of it and how that part of it works.
Yeah. So Dr. Timothy Clark is the one that came up with the 4 stages, right? And this is work that started, in 1965 with Warren Bettis and some others. And then Amy Edmondson has done some more recent work on it. But Dr. Clark's 4 stages talk about inclusion safety, learner safety, contributor safety, and challenger safety. So those are kind of the 4 stages. And I love that process because that first stage is inclusion safety, right? So for DEI practitioners that are talking about diversity and inclusion and how we need to belong and all of that. I'm like, if you don't have inclusion safety, none of this other stuff matters.
Right.
Like none of it.
Right.
People don't feel valued, seen, heard, connected in the organization, then it doesn't matter what else you do. It doesn't matter the diversity numbers that you have.
Right.
Because people aren't going to give you 100% of who they are, right? It's a reciprocal relationship. And I think it's very important that organizations understand that they have a role in this. This isn't about just giving people a job, but how are you treating them while they're there, right? Do they feel valued? Do they feel included? Can they share their ideas without fear of retribution, right? And so that's kind of how those stages work. So that first stage is inclusion. Do I feel seen? Am I treated as a human being, right? Learner safety. Do I have the opportunity to learn and grow and do so in a safe way without feeling that I'm dumb or, why am I even asking that question, right? You're encouraged to be curious. And that's not just about doing the job, but that could be about the industry that you're in or the culture of the organization, right? We have to give people time to learn those things. Then contributor safety. We as humans want to contribute. And most organizations, when they hire you, they want you to contribute immediately, but they got to go through those other stages. And so contributor safety really is about taking what you've learned and being able to give back to the organization, right? And share and help others learn in that process. And then challenger safety, feeling comfortable to speak up when you're not necessarily seeing what's happening, right? Or you have a different idea, or you see something that's going to go wrong. And there's some companies where it's like, oh, I'm not going to say anything because that I could get in trouble for that. And then everything else burns down.
Right.
And we've seen many companies in the organization, we've seen that happen, right? Especially when you talk about physical hazards. And so a lot of that in Amy Edmonton's work is what stops people from saying something. It's that fear of retribution. It's that fear of being dismissed. And so creating environments where people can speak up or they can challenge the status quo and not feel as if they're going to be demonized for doing that. And so as I've been doing this work and working through these 4 stages and working with clients, everyone feels like they're in that stage 4 until they get their results on these assessments, right? And then now it starts to come out of, oh, okay, yeah, there were some challenges that with this, or there's certain groups that are operating in different ways. And then what I also do is I look at it by demographics as well. So are women and men having different experiences? Are people of color having a different experience than their white counterparts? Depending on the data that they give me, or your heterosexual employees having a different experience than your LGBTQ plus community. And so we're looking at it from all those different angles. And that's when organizations really start to think about, okay, what are we doing? Is it the language that we're using? What are the experiences or the behaviors that need to stop? They start to kind of question, like, okay, what in our culture needs to shift?
Right.
And so that's where, I love this work, because now I can start to talk about diversity and inclusion in a very different way, because now we're talking about, okay, this is how you're acting in the workplace and how it's impacting people with different backgrounds, with different experiences, et cetera. So yeah, that's kind of how I bring those all together.
Sure. So, wow.
I know it's just lots to unpack.
It is. I can't say I have this book and I've read through it, all that type of thing. And I have seen, certainly in the work that I've done, a lot of folks who can get through the first couple of stages. They can get through they can include you and you can contribute something. We're just not going to do anything with it. You can be included. We can tell you can learn a few things, but once it gets to the point that you actually making a contribution. So it's right between 2 and 3 where I see a lot of organizations that, and definitely don't challenge anything. Yeah. Because as long as you'll be And this episode is going to be released during Black History Month. So a lot of Black people will get this one. As long as you're that kind of Black person who won't challenge everything, of course you can stay. Of course. Yeah. Oh yeah, you could. We'll keep you as long as you don't wear your hair in a certain way or use a colloquialism that we don't use or whatever.
Yeah.
And as this country has this, it has this really dark and bleak history around, particularly how Black people have been treated. And then you get the intersectionality of how Black women have been treated as a whole nother conversation. But again, it's right between 2 and 3 where that thing starts going off the rails.
it's that phenomenon called from pet to threat, right? Where you go from being kind of like the pet. Oh, yes, wonderful, great. And then when you start to get comfortable and start to speak up, now, okay, wait a minute. Now you're a threat to the organization. Now you're speaking outside of what we want you to be. And so now we have to get rid of you because you're not playing nice within this box that we thought we had you in. Right. And so lots of particularly Black women understand that phenomenon because it happens. It's a cycle. It's a cycle. And, every year there's this kind of drawing that comes out about, the experiences of women of color in the workplace. And every single year I have people that are like, yep, that's where I am in the cycle. Yep. Yep. That's where I am, or I've been through that. So it's nothing new, but my challenge to organizations is how do you break that cycle? Because it's not up to the people of color to break that. Right. So what are the behaviors that are causing that? What is the fear that's not allowing people to get from stage 3 to stage 4? Sure. So how did the equity equation come about? So after I went through all my trauma, I, interestingly enough, got a few phone calls of folks asking me if I wanted to do some work with them. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I'm going through this whole situation. And I have a cousin who had been a diversity and inclusion consultant for 40 years. So definitely before it was called DE&I, she had been doing this work. And so I was talking to her and we were just having this conversation, and the name, the equity equation, actually came from that one of our conversations. But she really helped me think about what it means to be a consultant in this space and how to shape people's thoughts and ideas around this work. And then I had another cousin who was a lawyer who decided, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. So she went into home organizing, and she was right a couple of months before me. And so she really helped me think about the business, like the administrative side of things. And so I left my former employer September 1st with the idea that November 1st, I'll start the equity equation and I'll kind of come out with this big launch. I started September 15th. I had 2 weeks. And my first client was someone I had worked with 15 years ago. And I have not looked back since. Wow. Like, it has been an amazing journey. I have now attained 3 coaching certifications in that time, in addition to the psychological safety stuff. Yeah, I mean, the company has morphed a few times in the last 3 years, but it really is focusing on working with leaders. I'm focusing mostly right now on people managers, because I'm realizing that's that section of the organization that they're being told this is what you need to do, but no one's helping them do it. Right. And so when I do the work around psychological safety, I do it at the department level, and I do one-on-one coaching with those leaders. Right. And really help them think about psychological safety for their teams. Sure. How they can show up as better managers. So some of that is emotional intelligence as well, too. And really help guide them in that process, because again, they're getting so many demands coming down from leadership, but then so many expectations coming up from their people. And so how do you balance that all? And so a lot of my work is really helping them balance that, but then show up authentically in that space. And sometimes that means saying, I don't know, when a question comes up. Sure. and earning some of that trust within the
Sure.
organization.
You'll probably recognize some of this from your days in dance, but it's been a number of years, but I played a little bit of sports, and coached a little bit just out of high school, and I figured out and still remember that in most sports, it's not about what your head does, it's not about what your feet do, it's about where your hips go. That's how you can tell in most sports. It's in wrestling, football, a lot of those are the ones I play. It's watch the person's hips and in organizations, the hips of the organizations are those middle managers.
Yes.
The head will say, oh yeah, we've got this great program and we went out and spent money and we've got the policy and we sent it down and by God, it's working. And the people at the bottom are going, this is what we need, and blah, blah, blah. And the folks in the middle
are like, what the?
And so I'm supposed to do that. How? You
Yep.
promoted me because I was good at that job, not this one.
Yep.
And you get tossed into it. I became a supervisor for the first time at 26 years old. I'd never supervised anybody in my life, and both the people I was supervising. So I made a fire lieutenant in Seattle, Washington. Both of them were my mom's age. And that was an issue in and of itself because I was always told you can't tell older people what to do.
Exactly.
So,
right.
But as you described how important it is to get the people who are in the middle, the people are closest to the work and the people doing the work. If they don't get this, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter. And a lot of that stems from my experiences, right? When I had issues in the workplace of, sexual harassment or racism, what have you, when we go to my manager and my manager had good intentions, but didn't know what to do. Right. And then they're going to HR, who's usually a white woman who doesn't know what to do. And so then they start to fumble. And the next thing you know, they're talking to legal, and legal's like, oh, this is a lawsuit. So and it goes into a very different direction. And so now I become the enemy instead of the victim. Right. And so I saw that several times in my career where, hindsight being 2020, I'm like, if my managers knew what to do, or if they were empowered to help or support in different ways, this could have ended up in a very different manner. Sure. Right. So that's why I spend a lot of time focusing on those people managers. Because again, you said so many people managers were good at their jobs, but they don't necessarily manage people. Right. And so it's how do you help them with those skills? Right. So a lot of, the work that I do too is I call them experiential learning sessions, where I talk people through like inclusive communication or understanding generation or understanding identities and some of the issues and challenges that people managers may not get because it's not their lived experience. Right. And so now that you've had this exposure, part of that experiential learning is, okay, now that you know this, what can you do with this? Yes. I find that, what's important for a lot of people who are responsible for the work of other people to understand the difference between managing the systems that people are in and managing the people themselves, because the people themselves are not the problem. The systems that we put those people into, I think it was W. Edwards Deming that said, if you look at a system and the system's not performing in the way that you expect, 95% of the problem is the system. But we tend to put 95% of the responsibility on the human being who's in the system and simply crank them through, grind them to dust, bring a new human being, put them in that same system and wonder why it doesn't work. Yeah. So share a little bit, now that you've been into this, certainly into the equation and doing this work for a while, talk to me about some success stories, because somebody out there has to have been getting this right. Somebody's getting it right. I mean, is there anybody who's getting it right? Parts of it right? It's interesting. So I have a client. I've been working with them. I was working with them for about 6 months. I was brought in because they had a number of women that were leaving the organization. And there was one particular team that this was happening on. And so I came in, I did, this assessment and did 6-month coaching with each of the leaders and did the reassessment at the end of the 6 months. And the one team that was kind of the problem child ended up getting the best scores at the end. But then a team that was doing really well, their scores dropped. So when I had a conversation with the CEO, he was just like, you know what? I now get this. I understand. Because he was like, the work that you've been doing has been helping this particular team, but this other team, because of some other challenges and issues, they've been my problem child for like the last month. And I'm like, it's showing up in the data. But the team that did well, what I found out was that leader, never been a leader before, never been a manager before, and was kind of doing this, well, I'm going to do what has been done to me. And it was not resonating with his staff at all. And he didn't say, but I'm kind of thinking that he might have had a misogynistic boss before. And so some of those behaviors is what led some of those women to leave. But through our coaching and through our work together, I was like, one of the most powerful questions that you can ask your team is, how can I support you? And he was just like, oh, because I've been kind of assuming I knew what they needed this entire time. And so they went from a score, I want to say it was like -33. It goes from -100 to +100. They went from like a -33 to a 56 or something like that. And I had to look at the data a couple of times to say, okay, wait a minute, that's a huge jump. But in looking at the content and looking at the comments, he was just much more intentional of how he was showing up with his employees. So I see that a lot. I also see, I have a couple of clients that have been working with me for several times. I have one that's going through, I think it's 4th iteration now. And they do it as a spot check. And they are so invested in this work. They are constantly listed as one of the best employers in their area, one of the best places to work, because they are so intentional in this work. And, every now and again, they'll come in, they're like, hey, we're having this issue with generations. Right. So they are also looking at the data and seeing kind of some of the gaps and where they can do more education and learning, and not just dismissing it, but really making it a part of the work that they're doing. So, I mean, I call all of my clients success stories because they're seeing results, right? And they're seeing impact. And what I'm hearing from the middle managers in particular is no one is talking to us about how we show up. And they appreciate that one-on-one coaching that allows them to have conversations about being a manager without talking about the work.
Sure.
Right. So that's, I think, the beauty of kind of the work that I do, and being able to be that conduit to help them think through, okay, I can do this without burning out, because I talk about self-care, a lot. And so how do you do that and take care of yourself in the process? Yep.
So wow. Oh boy.
I know we've been going forever.
It was it. Wow. So tell me, if there's someone out there right now, this conversation about DE&I, particularly post George Floyd, is fashionable. It is, and that's what I'd say, it's fashionable because not everybody, a lot of people say they want to do it. Some actually do it, and some just talk about it. So let's say there's someone listening right now that says, I want to, I know we need to, but I don't have any idea where to start. What guidance would you give folks on where to start? You're interested, you haven't had the big catastrophe yet. You're a little concerned with, some part of the organization from a diversity perspective.
Yeah.
Where should they start?
Give me a call.
Okay.
That's it. No. But honestly, that's where I use psychological safety a lot, right? Sure. Because that is not necessarily the flavor of the day, as people are thinking DEI is, and they're seeing it as a more general thing. But how I bring in diversity and inclusion is one through that stage one inclusion and by looking at the demographics, right? Because now we can have a conversation about the data, right? If people are having a different experience, it's going to show up. And so what can we do? And so it's a partnership. But I use psychological safety really as kind of that entry into this work. I also kind of call it sneaking in the vegetables. Sometimes people don't know that there's an issue, right? Until we do the psychological safety work, and it's an anonymous survey that the employees can take, and they start to look at the demographic data, right? Now it's like, okay, this is what we're dealing with, right? And so I can have those conversations with folks looking at their data. And I have found that when I do it that way, they're not as, what's the word? Defensive.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Because I'm coming in like, hey, we're doing psychological safety. Everyone is included. Everyone's involved. I'm not just handpicking certain groups. This is for everyone, but we're going to look at this data. We're going to disaggregate it.
Right.
So that you're seeing the experiences of as many groups as possible and who's having the most different experience based on the baseline. Right. So if the company's baseline is 50, who's having a negative 50 experience and who's having a 100 experience. Right. Okay. So that's kind of what I tell people is let's start with psychological safety and then kind of go from there and unpack what are some of the other areas that might need to be uncovered.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation about Maslow's hierarchy. And I find it so interesting that groups, individuals, organizations talk so much about self-actualization and engagement, and they miss the second step. These breathing, so the folks are breathing, they have food, they get sleep, they get all that physiological stuff. But if you don't get safety, none of the rest of it is going to happen.
None of it, we don't get any of that other stuff.
It's not happening. So let's have that conversation about safety. Let's get that one in. And once we get that one handled, and are able to, to keep it going because, this is an ongoing, you don't have Sacha show up this year.
Not a one and done.
Check the box and we're done because the organization will continue to change and the people who are there are going to continue to change.
Yeah.
And they're going to even see the world different. And if we're all blessed to get there, we're going to get older. And that's a new thing. I was sharing while we were off air, they had my mom here. She's not much older than me because she had me when she was a teenager, but she's getting to the point she's not as mobile as she used to be. So safety for her, there's some things we had to do in the house to make it feel safer for her so she'd even visit. So this goes on and on and on. It doesn't ever stop. But we're going to have to stop. But before we do, I have to ask about DE&I after 5. I just got to do it. You got to tell me about, because that's where I first saw you. I stumbled. I don't know. I saw you on LinkedIn. I go like, who is this lady talking about after 5? So tell my audience about DE&I after 5.
Yeah. So DEI after 5 is my video web series podcast that I started last year, actually around this time. And it started based on conversations I was having with other practitioners after 5, right? It's like, okay, let's go get a glass of something and talk about the foolishness that we dealt with today. Right. But it's really morphed into these conversations with DEI practitioners talking about aspects of diversity and inclusion that you don't necessarily hear in the workplace, right? So had you on talking about psychosocial hazards. The episode that came out, the first episode of this season is about restorative justice in DEI and what that looks like in corporate spaces. We're talking about, just all kinds of things and really trying to push people to think outside the box from standard diversity, equity, and inclusion topics, right, or highlighting things that they may not necessarily think about on a regular basis, right? So I have someone talking about Indigenous populations in DEI and how they're often less than 1%. But when you don't focus on them, they'll continue to be less than 1%, right? And so unless you're intentional about doing outreach. So that's DEI after 5. It is, a pet project that is kind of morphed, but I absolutely love it because it challenges me also in this space to really think outside the box when it comes to this work.
Sure. Well, if there are people out there, they want to take you up on that. They want to catch up with you, connect with you further. How would folks do that?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is theequityequationllc.com. And so you can find me there about the coaching, my consulting work, all of that's there. The podcast is there, and you can find past episodes. I have a download actually on there too around 5 things that people managers can do around psychological safety. Okay. So it's a quick little thing based on the 4 stages of psychological safety and things that they can do at each stage. You can find me on LinkedIn. Right. So I'm there. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter, all the socials. Right. You can find me on those. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, Sacha, it's been my pleasure. It's interesting how you can stumble across people, your paths cross, and all of a sudden you go like, got something. It just really, and I don't consider myself to be one of those who is a follower of everybody and everything. I'm just not that it's good or bad, but I have particular things that will pique my interest and go like, that lady got something over there. And I've just been very impressed by your work and the way that you approach your work. And again, this strong connection that you're able to make and verbalize this connection between DE&I and psychological safety and how they connect and how important they are. I won't be surprised by the next great thing you do. I'll just put it that way. I just won't be surprised. Yeah. So thank you so much for taking time to be with me on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As I have shared with people, this is an attempt on my part to get people in the United States who are interested in this topic, who are knowledgeable in this topic, to have a forum to be able to share what they're bringing to the table. I am hopeful someday that we will get to the point that many of the other 30 countries around the world that actually have some policies around this, because not everybody's going to do it just because it's a nice idea. Yeah. Some are going to have to be encouraged to do it by policy frameworks. And I think it's going to take multiple voices from, both the safety community and the diversity, equity, and inclusion community and the mental health community and the HR. I think we've all going to have to get together. Yeah. And just ultimately what we're looking for is workplaces that don't hurt.
Yes, that part.
That part. So again, thanks very much. And thanks to each of you who've tuned in this week. Check us out. You can follow us. Of course, you can follow me on LinkedIn. You can go to our find previous episodes of the podcast at psychhealthandsafetyusa.com. And we're just happy to have you. Thank you to we just crossed over a few weeks ago, 1,000 subscribers. So we're really happy about that. And looking forward to the next episode and the next conversation on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.